October 7th, 1940. A date lost to the shadow of the December attack that would follow a year later. In Warren, Michigan, just 17 miles north of the roaring engines of Detroit, there was only silence. A desolate stretch of 113 acres of frozen farmland sat beneath a sky the color of cold lead. There were two buildings, a skeletal farmhouse and a sagging barn, both ghosts of a vanishing agricultural era. This soil was dark, heavy with the coming winter, and completely indifferent to the fact that 5,000 miles away, the world was being torn apart. Europe had been drowning in blood for over a year. The Nazi blitzkrieg had perfected a new kind of mechanical terror, a lightning war that used steel teeth to bite through borders. But here, in the American heartland, the isolationist peace was still thick enough to touch. That silence was about to be shattered. Within 8 months, this empty mud would be transformed into the most lethal industrial complex on the planet. It would become the crucible of American armored warfare. The fate of the sands of North Africa and the survival of the British Empire would not be decided by generals in London, but by the blueprints drawn right here on this frozen Michigan ground. At precisely 9:47 a.m., a black sedan cut through the mist, its tires crunching on the gravel. K.T. Keller, the iron-willed president of Chrysler Corporation, stepped out into the biting wind. He had been summoned by a higher power, not a king, but a necessity. The US government had issued a mandate that bordered on the delusional. Build 1,000 tanks in less than 2 years. Keller looked at the weeds and the rotting barn. He didn't see nothing. He saw a battlefield. The urgency had started months earlier in the marble halls of Washington, D.C., July 1940. William Knudsen, the production genius of General Motors, received a call from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The president's voice was calm, but the subtext was panic. America's army was a joke, ranked 19th in the world, numerically inferior to Portugal. The arsenal of democracy was currently an empty shed, possessing fewer than 400 tanks, most of them rattling relics with riveted armour that would turn into shrapnel upon impact. Roosevelt needed a miracle. Knudsen called Keller. "Can you build tanks?" Keller, a man who didn't know how to lie to himself, replied, "I don't know. I've never even seen one." 3 weeks later, Keller stood inside the Rock Island Arsenal, staring at an M2A1 medium tank. It was a 19-ton puzzle of 8,000 individual parts, each requiring tolerances so precise they were measured in the width of a human hair. Keller circled the beast like a predator studying its prey. He wasn't looking at a weapon. He was calculating welds, transmissions, and the raw logistics of mass production. He realized that to build the future of war, he had to destroy the present. Chrysler wouldn't just build tanks in an old factory. They would conjure a titan from the mud. On October 17th, the farmhouse was levelled. The barn followed. By nightfall, the land was flat, a blank canvas for the architect of industry, Albert Kahn. The clock was ticking, and the monster was beginning to wake. The winter of 1940 was a cruel adversary. In the Michigan lowlands, the mercury plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the soil into something as hard as the armor plate they intended to forge. But Albert Kahn, the architect of Detroit, didn't believe in the impossible. He had 8 months to erect a structure that spanned 5 city blocks in depth, a 1.25 million square foot behemoth of reinforced concrete and glass. For the first 6 weeks, Kahn didn't even have formal blueprints.
He lived in a fever dream of sketches on scrap paper and shouted orders over telephone lines, calculating load-bearing requirements for machines that hadn't been invented yet. Construction became a theatre of industrial endurance. Thousands of men descended upon Warren from the coal mines of Tennessee and the shuttered mills of Ohio.
They worked in 12-hour shifts, a relentless tide of labour that never ebbed. To keep the concrete from freezing before it set, they brought in steam locomotives, their boilers hissing like prehistoric beasts, pumping heat into the construction site through a labyrinth of pipes. Welders worked with torches in one hand and coffee in the other, their breath freezing into ice crystals on their masks between every strike of the hammer. They weren't just building a factory. They were building a fortress with walls 3 feet thick, designed to withstand the very Luftwaffe bombs that were currently levelling London. While the walls rose through the snow, a deeper magic was happening in the shadows of Chrysler's Highland Park complex. Behind locked doors and under the gaze of armed guards,
30 engineers were performing a ritual of reverse engineering. They had 60 days to take the hand-built M2A1 tank, a machine designed by craftsmen to be assembled one at a time, and tear it apart, bolt by bolt. They discovered a fatal flaw. The Army's design was a mess of inconsistent tolerances. It was a masterpiece of the old world that couldn't survive the new world of mass production. The Highland Park team didn't just copy the tank, they reinvented it. They simplified the transmission, reducing 147 individual parts to 87 rugged components. They replaced hand-formed plates with stamped steel panels that could be smashed out by the thousands. They created jigs and gauges so precise that a farm boy from Indiana could assemble a gearbox with the accuracy of a Swiss watchmaker. By January 1941, they had birthed a new soul for American steel. On paper, it was the M3 Lee, a stopgap, a compromise. But to the men in the frozen mud of Michigan, it was number one. The Detroit Arsenal wasn't even finished. It didn't even have a roof, but the assembly line was already starting to breathe. By December 1941, as the smoke was still rising from the ruins of Pearl Harbor, the Detroit Arsenal shed its civilian skin and became a predator. The factory never slept. The lights of Building 84 burned with a fierce, artificial sun that blinded the stars over Michigan. It was a 24-hour symphony of industrial violence. The day shift, the night shift, and the swing shift. A relentless human tide that moved in perfect synchronization with the conveyor belts. The silence of the old farmland was gone, replaced by the pneumatic scream of rivet guns and the bone-shaking roar of 9-cylinder aircraft engines being tested in the rear bays. This wasn't just a factory, it was a sociological revolution. The workforce was a mosaic of a changing America. There were farm boys from the northern reaches of Michigan who had never seen a micrometer, and office clerks from Detroit who traded their pens for welding torches. But the most striking change was the arrival of the Rosies, thousands of women who answered the call of the arsenal of democracy. They stepped out of their kitchens and into grease-stained coveralls, their hair tied back in bandanas, their eyes shielded by darkened goggles. They learned to judge a weld by the colour of the spark and to install a transmission in under 11 minutes. Alongside them were black workers who had travelled north on the Great Migration from Alabama and Georgia, escaping the Jim Crow South for a chance to weld the armour of freedom. Inside the arsenal, the colour of your skin mattered less than the precision of your bead. But beneath the patriotic posters, the reality was a grinding, physical hell. The factory floor in July was a furnace, reaching temperatures of 110 degrees Fahrenheit.
The metal hulls became so hot they would sear flesh upon contact. In the winter, the massive concrete walls acted like a refrigerator, holding the Michigan frost in a death grip that numbed fingers inside thick leather gloves. Accidents were the silent tax of production. A misaligned crane could crush a limb in a heartbeat. A stray spark could blind a welder for life. There were no holidays, no weekends, only the board at the front gate that counted the daily quota. 12 tanks, 15, 18. Each number was paid for in sweat, exhaustion, and sometimes blood. These workers weren't just building machines. They were forging the willpower of a nation, one rivet at a time. Summer 1942. The fate of the free world hung by a thread in the burning sands of North Africa. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had driven his Panzer Army Africa to the very doorstep of Cairo. The British Eighth Army was shattered, their tanks burning relics in the dust of Libya. Tobruk had fallen. The Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the British Empire, was within Nazi reach. But while Rommel waited for fuel and spare parts that never arrived across the Mediterranean, a mechanical tidal wave was crossing the Atlantic. They were the M4 Shermans, fresh from the grease and heat of the Detroit Arsenal. When they arrived at El Alamein in September 1942, the British crews looked at them with disbelief. These weren't the fragile, cramped cruiser tanks they were used to. The Sherman was a 33-ton beast of American pragmatism. It had thick armour, a 75mm gun that could punch through a Panzer IV at combat range, and a gyro stabilizer that allowed it to fire with deadly accuracy while moving, a feat the Germans could only dream of. But its greatest weapon wasn't its gun, it was its soul. The Sherman used a suspension system borrowed from American farm tractors, robust, simple, and nearly impossible to break. While Rommel's tanks sat idle waiting for complex German gears, the Shermans kept moving. On the night of October 23, 1942, nearly 900 British artillery guns tore the desert sky apart. It was the beginning of Operation Lightfoot. Among the 1,000 Allied tanks charging into the Devil's Gardens, the massive German minefields, were 252 Shermans from Michigan. The battle became a meat grinder of attrition. Shermans burned, but for every one lost, or 2 more rolled off the ships in Alexandria. This was the arithmetic of industrial warfare that Rommel couldn't defeat. By November 4th, the Africa Corps was broken. Rommel wrote in his diary that the battle was decided not by British courage alone, but by the overwhelming capacity of American factories. Back in Detroit, the workers saw the record on their boards: 896 tanks in a single month. They didn't know the names of the boys in the desert, but they knew that every weld they held together was a nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the Detroit Arsenal had etched its name into the bedrock of history. This single facility, built on a frozen Michigan farm in just 8 months, had produced 22,234 tanks, a staggering 25% of all American armoured production. To put that in perspective, this one factory outproduced the entire tank industry of Great Britain for the whole war, and it delivered more steel Predators than the entire German Reich could manufacture between 1940 and 1943. But the true legacy of Detroit wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the philosophy of the good enough. The Sherman was never meant to be a super tank. It was a weapon of democratic logistics. While the Germans spent thousands of man-hours
handcrafting a single Tiger tank. A beautiful, complex, but over-engineered clockwork nightmare. The workers in Michigan were stamping out Shermans like coins. The math was brutal. For every Tiger that knocked out a Sherman, there were 10 more Shermans arriving from the ports. For every German mechanic struggling with a broken torsion bar, there was an Allied crew fixing a Sherman with a wrench and a spare part that fit perfectly every single time. The war wasn't won by a superior machine, it was won by superior capacity. It was won by the welders, the crane operators, and the Rosies who proved that a free people could outproduce a slave empire. The Detroit Arsenal didn't vanish when the victory parades ended. It retooled for the Cold War, birthing the Patterns, and eventually the M1 Abrams, the modern king of the battlefield. It operated for 56 years until the final gates closed in 1996. Today the assembly lines are gone, and the heavy thud of the presses has been replaced by the quiet hum of research offices. But if you stand on those 113 acres in Warren, Michigan, you can still feel the ghost of the arsenal of democracy. You feel it in the memory of the men and women who worked 20-hour shifts until their eyes bled from the welding arcs. They never wore a uniform, and they never saw the sands of El Alamein. But they were the ones who gave the soldiers their feet and the world its freedom. They turned a frozen field into the anvil upon which the fate of humanity was hammered out. And that is the arithmetic of democracy. That ordinary people, when pushed to the brink, can do the impossible.